Hello everyone, I'm Pastor Noel Schoonmaker and I want to welcome you to Wednesday Bible Study here at Second Baptist Church of Richmond. We are currently studying Galatians verse by verse, and today we will look at Galatians 4 verses 1 through 5. Let's begin with Galatians 4 verse 1. My point is, for however long the heir is a child, he differs nothing from a slave, though he is Lord of the whole estate. Having established that all who have faith in Christ are sons of Abraham and heirs of God's promise, Paul expands the analogy of inheritance by explaining how Christians have become heirs of God. His goal in the first 7 verses of chapter 4 is to show how Gentile Christians in Galatia have transitioned from slaves to sons. Paul begins by observing that when an heir of an estate is still a minor, he is much like a slave, even though he has been chosen to own and operate the estate. Although the child heir is not like a slave in every way, both are surrounded by a set of constraints, and neither has executive authority over the household. Verse 2, but is under guardians and trustees until the time appointed by his father. The child heir is like a slave in that he is not his own master. Guardians and trustees exercise authority over the heir as long as he is a minor. The Greek term that is translated guardians refers to legally designated guardians or tutors who often had charge of children. The Greek term that is translated trustees refers to a general class of stewards or administrators, often slaves, who were appointed to manage the affairs of ancient households. Paul says the child heir is under these authority figures, echoing Galatians 3:22, where he said human beings are under the power of sin. The analogy is beginning to compare the bondage of minors with bondage to sin, and the maturation of minors with liberation from sin. A key term in verse 2 is until. Paul is clear that the child heir is under such authorities and restrictions for a temporary period, specifically until the time that has been appointed by the father. According to ancient Roman law, the child heir was no longer a minor when he turned 14. But fathers had the ability to coordinate the timing of when an heir received the inheritance. Bible scholar F.F. Bruce notes an ancient passage written by Justinian that says, beyond question, a tutor may be appointed until a fixed time, or from a fixed time, or conditionally, or before the institution of an heir. Bruce also cites the will of Eudaimon of Oxyrhynchus, dated 126 CE. The will pertains to 2 of the man's sons that were minors. It says, if I die before the said Horus and Eudaimon have completed 20 years, their brother Thonus and their maternal grandfather Harpasus, also called Horus, son of Thonus, shall be guardian of each of them until he completes 20 years. In this case, a father stipulated that if he were to die before his sons turned 20, they would be under the charge of guardians until they reached the age of 20. This arrangement is akin to modern-day arrangements wherein parents draw up a will to allow certain persons to become guardians of their children in case both parents die, or to specify that children receive a certain inheritance when they reach a certain age. Paul's comment that the child heir is a minor only until the time appointed by the father is mainly a setup for his theological application of this illustration in Galatians 4:4, when he says that God sent the Son when the fullness of time had come. He is drawing a parallel between the state of humanity before the coming of Christ and the state of child heirs who have not yet reached the time when they receive their full inheritance as sons. On to verse 3. So also we, when we were children, had been enslaved by the elemental principles of the world. Paul shifts from third person to second person, applying the analogy of inheritance to himself and the Christians to whom he is writing. He says that just as a child heir is constrained by various restrictions and operates under the authority of certain powers until he reaches an appointed age, likewise, he and all Christians formerly operated in a state of bondage. Specifically, they were enslaved by the elemental principles of the world. This important phrase is difficult to interpret. The Greek term translated elementary principles is stoicheia, which literally means the things that belong to a series. It was used to refer to the alphabet, a series of letters and sounds that is basic to learning. Consequently, the term came to refer to the rudimentary principles of any area of knowledge. Even more specifically, the term often referred to the four elementary substances: earth, water, air, and fire. Ancient people had different views of these stoicheia. For example, many believed that Isis, an ancient goddess revered by the Gentiles, controlled the stoicheia and provided protection from them. According to the 2nd century Christian writer Clement of Alexandria, philosophers ascribed divine qualities to the stoicheia. The Jewish writer Philo likewise remarked that some people deify the stoicheia. However, 2 Peter 3:10 asserts the Lord's power over the stoicheia. That passage says, "The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a loud voice, and the elements," stoicheia, "will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed." In the ancient context of Galatians, therefore, the stoicheia were understood as quasi-divine powers and principles that held great sway within creation. They are akin to what Ephesians 6:12 calls the cosmic powers of this present darkness and the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places, against which humanity constantly struggles. These antagonistic forces that enslaved humanity before the coming of Christ include aspects of Gentile philosophy and the Jewish law. Paul views all humanity, Jews and Gentiles, as enslaved to the stoicheia, just as he views all humanity as under the power of sin. Theologically speaking, enslavement to the stoicheia is another way that Paul describes the human condition and demonstrates our need for redemption. Verse 4, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law." Paul relates the moment when a minor reaches the age of a full-blown heir to the moment God sent Christ. The tacit assumption is that Christ is pre-existent with God the Father and became a human being as part of His mission to save humanity. As Paul says in Philippians 2:6-7, Christ was in the form of God and emptied Himself, being born in human likeness and taking on human form. The phrase fullness of time reflects Paul's apocalyptic mindset. Jesus demonstrated a similar mindset when He said in Mark 1:15, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near." Like Jesus, Paul viewed history in terms of two eras: the age before the coming of Christ and the age after the coming of Christ. At the time God appointed, God sent Jesus Christ into the world to end the age of sin and death and to liberate humanity from bondage to the stoicheia. The Greek term translated "sent" implies that God the Father sent Christ the Son on a mission. Christ came to earth to carry out work that God intended to accomplish. The phrasing about God sending the Son echoes Romans 8:3, where Paul says, "God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. And to deal with sin, He condemned sin in the flesh." It also evokes John 3:16-17. "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through Him." The language of God sending the Son further appears in 1 John 4, 9 through 10. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent His only Son into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Bible scholar Richard Hayes notes that since multiple New Testament passages penned by Paul and John speak of God sending God's Son into the world, some interpreters hypothesize that in Galatians 4, 4 through 5, Paul is quoting a confessional sending formula that was current in early Christian communities. In any case, there is a coherent conviction among various New Testament books that God the Father sent the divine Son, Jesus Christ, into the world in order to save humanity. Paul says Christ was born of a woman, which does not distinguish Christ from anyone else on the planet. Paul does not appear to have been familiar with the doctrine of the virgin birth. If he was familiar with it, he never mentioned it in his letters. In fact, only 2 books in the New Testament mention the virgin birth, Matthew and Luke. Still, Paul's statement that Christ was born of a woman is not meaningless because it emphasizes the humanity of Jesus Christ. Christ did not fall out of the sky straight from heaven. He spent months as a fetus in Mary's womb and then slid through the birth canal before emerging into the world. We can see in verse 4 one of the key teachings of Christianity across the centuries. In order to redeem human beings, Christ became a human being. Since the early church, the Orthodox position has been that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. But how do we make sense of this? Perhaps a brief lesson in historical theology is in order. In the 4th century, a preacher named Arius argued that Christ had a beginning. Arius stated, before Christ was begotten or created or appointed or established, He did not exist. We are persecuted because we say the Son has a beginning, but God is without beginning. Arius was an eloquent rhetorician who put his ideas into short jingles that people could sing while working on the docks or playing in the schoolyard, thereby enabling their rampant dissemination. His famous slogan about Christ was, "There was when He was not." This created quite the controversy. Indeed, one early church leader reported that in the city of Constantinople, if you asked somebody for change, they would ask you if you thought the Son was in the beginning with God or not. However, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which was summoned by the Emperor Constantine and attended by approximately 300 bishops, the view prevailed that Christ was true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same substance with the Father. All the bishops present, except 2, supported this view, which was over 99%. The Latin term translated "of the same substance" is homoousis. An early preacher named Athanasius championed the view that Jesus was homoousis, or of the same substance as God. He wrote, "Being God, He became a human being, and then as God, He raised the dead, healed all by a word, and also changed water into wine." Athanasius, a great early Christian leader, reasoned that Jesus had to be fully divine in order to save us. "The Word was made man in order that we might be made divine," he said. This belief is supported by numerous scriptures, including John 1:1, Philippians 2:6-7, and Colossians 1:15-20, while Arius' view that Christ was not divine is very difficult to defend in light of the New Testament. At the same time, the New Testament indicates that Christ was fully human. This conviction is clear in passages such as Luke 2:40 and Hebrews 2:14. Still, in the 4th century, a preacher named Apollinarius of Laodicea taught, "The Word Himself has become flesh without having assumed a human mind. that is, a changeable mind which is enslaved to filthy thoughts, but which exists as an immutable and heavenly divine mind. Apollinarius thought that humanity was the sphere of salvation, but not the vehicle of salvation, so he essentially denied the full humanity of Jesus Christ. But Gregory of Nazianzus famously retorted, "What has not been assumed has not been healed. It is what is united to His divinity that is saved." In other words, Jesus had to have been fully human in order to save human beings. In the 5th century, a teacher named Eutyches rejected the full humanity of Christ. He believed that the human nature of Christ was absorbed into Christ's divine nature. Basically, he held to a one-nature theory that Jesus was solely divine. This and similar teachings became known as the Monophysite or one-nature view of Christ. But the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, which was attended by approximately 400 bishops, affirmed that Jesus was fully God and fully human. The council wrote that Jesus is perfect in divinity and humanity, truly God and truly human, consisting of a rational soul and a body, being of one substance with the Father in relation to His divinity, and being of one substance with us in relation to His humanity, and is like us in all things apart from sin, who is to be acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. This Chalcedon decision channeled the views of Leo the Great, who said, "For we could not overcome the author of sin and death unless He had taken our nature and made it His own, whom sin could not defile, nor death retain." Most Christians, including those of Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox traditions, have embraced the teaching of Chalcedon as a proper description of the God-man, Jesus Christ, fully human and fully divine in two natures. However, many Christians in the Near East did not embrace Chalcedon. They instead maintained that Christ had one nature in which the divine and the human were indistinguishable. Modern-day churches representing this historical trajectory include the Egyptian Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Coptic Church, and the Jacobite Church in Syria and India. While the particulars of Jesus' identity as the divine Son of God have been debated for centuries, Paul's identification of Jesus Christ as God's Son in Galatians 4:4 evokes the image of the child heir who has not yet reached the age at which he receives the full inheritance from the Father. In this passage, Jesus takes on the plight of human beings that battle the stoicheia. Paul adds that Christ was born under the law, which means Christ subjected Himself to the custody of the law, just as the child heir in verse 2 was subject to trustees and guardians. The phrase about Jesus being born under law also indicates that Jesus was Jewish. Bible scholar Ann Jervis surmises that the false teachers in Galatia might have cited Jesus' Jewish birth in seeking to persuade Gentiles to submit to circumcision and other works of the Old Testament law. In other words, they may have pressured Gentile Christians to undergo circumcision on the grounds that Christ Himself was a circumcised Jew. If this was the case, Paul may be offering a counterpoint here to show that Jesus' Jewish birth does not necessitate that those who believe in Him also become Jewish, but rather His Jewish birth shows that He has shared our state of subjection to the law. This point is crucial because Christ's mission was to redeem those under the law. And now for verse 5, so that He might redeem those under the law, that we might receive sonship. Christ was born under the law to liberate humanity from the law's constraints. As Bruce puts it, Christ entered into the prison house where His people were held in bondage so as to set them free. Since Christ assumed subjection to the law, He can save those who have been subject to the law. Since He has been born of a woman, He can save those who have been born of a woman. since he has shared the plight of human beings struggling against the stoicheia. He can redeem us from the stoicheia. The immediate point in verse 5 is that Christ has redeemed those under the law. The Greek term translated redeemed connotes emancipation from slavery. It evokes the idea of paying the price to buy freedom for a slave. It's reminiscent of Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 6:20, "You were bought with a price." In light of Christ's example, Christians throughout the centuries have sometimes purchased the freedom of actual slaves. For example, there is evidence that ancient Christians sometimes pooled funds to purchase the freedom of a Christian slave. In other cases, individual Christians volunteered to become slaves in order to free those who were in slavery. In such cases, the price of redemption was not a sum of money, but rather a free person becoming a slave on a slave's behalf. It was a matter of switching places. For example, in the late 1st century, the Christian leader Clement of Rome wrote to a congregation in Corinth, saying, "We know of many among us who gave themselves up to fetters in order to ransom others. Many gave themselves up to slavery, and taking their sale price, they furnished food for others." Imagining the literal ransom of a slave can give us a deeper appreciation for Christ's ministry of redemption. Theologically speaking, Christ became a slave on the cross to set us free. As Matthew 20:28 says, Christ gave His life a ransom for many. Jesus volunteered to become a slave so that we could receive the gift of freedom. He took our shackles and put them on Himself so that we could be liberated. He took our sin upon Himself too. The ministry of redemption was carried out not only in the incarnation, when Jesus became a human being, but especially in His crucifixion. Paul has already told us in Galatians 3:13 that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us when He died on the cross. When He allowed Himself to be constrained on a cross, He was loosening the spiritual shackles that the stoicheia used to keep us in bondage. Christ has redeemed us from slavery, Paul says, so that we might receive sonship. This happens by way of adoption, a well-known practice in ancient Rome. In the Roman system, an adopted son was legally on the exact same footing as biological sons. This meant, among other things, that an adopted son could be an heir just as a biological son could. In fact, from late in the 1st century until well into the 2nd century, successive Roman emperors adopted men who were unrelated to them by blood to become successors to the throne. If adopted children could inherit the throne of Rome, they could certainly inherit any other type of bequest. The idea in verse 5 is that Christ redeems us so that we can be adopted as God's children. Christ alone is God's Son by nature. All others are God's children by grace. Christ alone is God's biological Son. All others are God's children by adoption. Verse 5 is emphatic that Christ redeemed us from slavery to the powers of this world for a new life of freedom in God's family. In short, without Christ, we are slaves to sin. With Christ, we are sons of God. Christ took slaves and made us sons. He took people who had no inheritance and made us full heirs of God's promises. As adopted children of God, says Romans 8:17, we are joint heirs with Christ. In 1907, a New Yorker named Francis Fernald died. Having amassed quite a fortune as a produce broker, he left all of his wealth to his wife, Sarah. During the following years, Sarah met a young seminary student named Henry. The two of them developed a mother-son type of bond, and in 1916, she legally adopted him. When Sarah Fernald died in 1920, the New York Times reported that she left most of her estate to her adopted son. Henry's inheritance was worth over $1 million, which today, if adjusted for inflation, would total over $13 million. Just as the headline in 1920 reported that an adopted son inherited $1 million, the headline in Galatians 4:5 reports that God's adopted children also get an inheritance. Like Jesus, who walked the earth as God's beloved Son, we too shall inherit resurrection from the dead. As children adopted by our loving heavenly parent, we stand to inherit abundant life on earth and everlasting life in the kingdom of heaven. There is no richer inheritance. That's all for now. I hope you'll join us next time when we pick up our study in Galatians 4, verse 6. The Lord bless you and keep you.